On August 18th, 2025, Ibrahim Traoré did the unthinkable. He ordered the entire United States Embassy out of Burkina Faso. But here's the reverse question. Is this real courage or just reckless theater? Some call it sovereignty in action. Others call it the fastest road to starvation. And then the twist. While crowds shout, sovereignty is not for sale, over 2 million citizens still survive on food and medicine tied directly to Western aid. This is Ibrahim Traoré, born in 1988, now in his 30s, the captain turned interim president of Burkina Faso, celebrated by some as Africa's lion, dismissed by others as a dangerous gambler. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what would you choose in life? Dignity first or comfort first? Share your own habits, your own perspective. Because after all, this story is not just about Africa. It's about choices every one of us makes. You're watching Legends by the River, a channel bringing raw African headlines to an American audience that refuses to settle for silence. If you're new here, welcome. Make yourself comfortable. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next turn of history. Now let's move to the streets of Ouagadougou. The embassy gates are locked, the flags are falling, and a storm is already in motion. The streets of Ouagadougou did not wake to celebration. They woke to silence, broken only by the scrape of boots and the thud of rifles against shoulders. Soldiers lined the boulevard leading to the US Embassy, a sight almost surreal for a capital that once prided itself on hosting international missions. And then came the order. No delay, no negotiation. Within 72 hours, the Americans must leave. Behind the gates, embassy staff packed boxes in haste, pale faces in the Sahel sun, glancing over their shoulders as if history itself were watching. Outside, however, a different scene unfolded. Crowds pressed forward with flags, chanting about sovereignty, as if the lowering of one banner could erase decades of dependence. It was a moment that looked powerful on camera, yet carried the strange weight of a paradox. A nation rejecting the very partner that funded its schools and stocked its clinics. Observers in Washington and Paris called it reckless, but for many Burkinabè youth, it felt like vindication. They shouted louder, convinced that one act could rewrite the narrative of colonial legacy. And here is the subtle twist. Most Americans, if asked, might admit they rarely think about Burkina Faso at all. Yet for those in the square, this single expulsion felt like a global earthquake. How often do small nations gamble that their defiance will even be noticed? If you pause for a second, you may see the human contradiction. One veteran leaned on his crutch, whispering that arrogance was being buried. At the same time, mothers worried aloud about medicine shortages, a reminder that dignity without bread can turn quickly into despair. People everywhere understand this trade-off. Americans themselves debate it in another form. Security versus liberty, comfort versus principle. The dilemma may change clothes, but the skeleton is the same. As night fell, the chants still echoed. The embassy gates remained locked, the US flag drooped halfway, and the AES colors fluttered across town. What began as silence had turned into spectacle, and that spectacle was now feeding on itself. The question lingering in the air was not just about one embassy. It was about how far this defiance could stretch before reality pushed back. And that tension was only just beginning to surface. The spark was not a bomb or a battle. It was a document stamped in Washington. A US report quietly filed through bureaucratic channels labeled Burkina Faso's army alongside extremist groups. To an outsider, it was paperwork. To Traoré, it was an insult that cut deeper than bullets. Inside the presidential palace, aides watched as he scribbled red marks across the pages. He read aloud the words that equated his soldiers, men who had bled in Djibo and Yaga, with terrorists who slaughtered families. The room stiffened. Some ministers shifted uncomfortably, whispering that perhaps the Americans did not understand. Traoré snapped laid back. 2 million displaced since 2010, 2,000 dead last year, and still Washington reduced their defenders to criminals. And here's the irony. In American living rooms, most people might skim such a report, barely noticing the names of distant towns. Yet in Ouagadougou, the same paragraphs were received like a national dagger. Doesn't it say something about how words, when written in one capital, can burn down trust in another? The fury spread quickly. On state television, anchors repeated his outrage, asking who gave the United States the authority to define Africa's dignity. In the barracks, young soldiers clenched their fists. One muttered that if their own allies called them criminals, then what was left of honor? Another spat that their sacrifice in the Sahel meant nothing to people sipping coffee thousands of miles away. This was the pivot. A simple report turning into a firestorm, a technical assessment morphing into a national insult. It's a reminder that most societies, whether in America or Africa, respond less to numbers than to the story wrapped around them. And when the story strips away respect, the response is rarely calm. By dusk, the line between paperwork and provocation had blurred completely. Traoré had found his rallying cry, and the people had found their symbol of defiance. The question now was no longer about one report. It was about how far Burkina Faso would go once anger had replaced diplomacy. He didn't wait for diplomats to cool tempers. He went straight to the microphone. On national television, Traoré declared that Burkina Faso was not expelling a building, but an attitude. His voice was sharp, the words rehearsed yet raw, echoing across living rooms where families sat on worn couches, listening with clenched jaws. The broadcaster's tone carried the anger further. If America dared to call their soldiers violators, then who gave Washington the authority to define dignity itself? And here the paradox deepened. The very superpower providing food aid was now branded as the thief of honor. It's the kind of contradiction that raises the question: when people are forced to choose, do they cling to survival or to pride? Most Americans, if asked, might admit they would struggle with the same choice. Is liberty still liberty if it comes with hunger? In the barracks of Kaya, young conscripts listened in silence. One soldier muttered that their captain had told the truth. They call us criminals. Another, still scarred from fighting jihadists in Yaga, spat that America counted numbers on paper, but never the graves dug by villagers with bare hands. And in that moment, what began as a policy statement became a matter of personal insult. You could feel the shift. Bureaucratic language had transformed into a fight for identity. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates, holding signs that read, "Sovereignty is not for sale." Yet behind the chanting was another layer, fear of what came next. Ministers exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that rejecting Washington's report meant more than words. It meant putting aid, medicine, and global alliances on the line. This was the subtle twist inside the drama. The louder the people shouted, the more fragile their safety net became. The speech ended, but the echo lingered. The sun dipped behind Ouagadougou, leaving a square full of clenched fists and anxious eyes. And as the crowd dispersed into the night, the tension hardened into something irreversible. The sense that Burkina Faso had crossed a threshold it could not step back from, no matter what storm followed. Washington called it diplomatic suicide. Paris labeled it reckless. And Brussels warned of deepening isolation. Yet in Moscow, state television hailed it as emancipation, while Beijing chose silence, but quietly dispatched envoys with offers of aid. The same event fractured the world into applause, warnings, and calculated watchfulness. In the West, analysts filled airwaves with grim predictions. American headlines spoke of 100 million in assistance vanishing overnight. European diplomats muttered that Traoré was cutting the last rope to stability. And here lies the irony. What the West framed as collapse, many in the Sahel heard as liberation. How often does the same act read as disaster in one capital and destiny in another? In Ouagadougou, ministers pored over every line of foreign reactions. Some saw danger, others hailed opportunity. And then came the twist. Russia praised loudly, but Traoré himself dismissed easy alignment, saying dignity is not for hire. At the same time, China's muted gestures suggested partnership without rhetoric, a move that forced even seasoned diplomats to ask which approach ordinary people trusted more, loud applause or quiet support. For everyday citizens, the debate filtered down to simple images. Before, the tricolor flags of former powers dominated their skyline. Now, whispers of a multipolar world reached their radios. People compared then and now. Yesterday, they were told sovereignty was a slogan. Today, they saw embassies closing their doors because of it. And in that contrast, pride rose even as uncertainty deepened. Americans watching from afar might relate to the human instinct beneath it all. According to countless studies on decision making, when pride collides with practicality, people often lean toward pride, at least at first. Whether it's a worker quitting a job after being disrespected or a nation expelling an embassy after being insulted, the emotional logic feels strikingly familiar. As that settled, the city's rhythm reflected that duality, chants of victory mixing with murmurs of fear about tomorrow. And in that fragile balance between exaltation and anxiety, Burkina Faso stood at the edge of a new chapter, waiting to see whether the world's applause or condemnation would carry more weight. Aid was never meant to feel like chains. Yet that is exactly how Traoré framed it when his ministers warned that cutting ties with Washington could drain schools, hospitals, and food programs overnight. He struck the table and declared, "Better hunger in freedom than bread in humiliation." The line spread instantly, repeated by state broadcasters and whispered in market stalls. But here's the dilemma. Freedom doesn't feed children, and pride doesn't stock pharmacies. By every estimate, more than 100 million in annual American assistance could vanish. Clinics already short on supplies faced closure. Teachers who relied on foreign-funded salaries wondered how long classrooms could stay open. The contradiction was stark. Defiance raised voices in the streets, but it also tightened stomachs at home. And yet people still rallied. In the Sahel camps, a farmer told reporters he would rather starve with dignity than eat with shame. To many Americans listening, that kind of statement may sound reckless. But pause for a moment. How many workers in the US have walked out of a job, choosing self-respect over a paycheck? Human nature repeats itself. The scale changes, but the instinct is the same. The twist deepened when foreign powers rushed to fill the gap. Russia promised solidarity. China hinted at quiet aid. Turkey pledged hospitals. None of it matched the reliability of Western funding, but the very offers shifted perception. A narrative took hold that alternatives existed, even if fragile. That hope, however thin, became fuel for defiance. At the human level, the shift was visible. Yesterday, aid was accepted with bowed heads. Today, rejection was shouted with clenched fists. It showed how quickly identity can pivot when people feel their dignity is being priced. Studies on behavior confirm this. Once respect is stripped away, most people will endure hardship longer than outsiders expect. By nightfall, Ouagadougou's streets hummed with chants and uncertainty in equal measure. Children waved flags, elders prayed aloud, and ministers calculated losses behind closed doors. The city seemed suspended between triumph and risk, its mood flickering like a candle in the wind. And in that fragile glow, the question of what dignity was truly worth lingered, waiting for the next act to reveal its price. For the first time in decades, the most powerful nation on earth no longer flew its flag in Ouagadougou. The gates of the US embassy clanged shut, and in its place, the banner of the Sahel Alliance rose. The contrast was jarring. One flag folded into silence, another lifted by the hands of students and veterans who swore that sovereignty had finally arrived. State television framed it as history in the making. Traoré addressed the nation, insisting that Burkina Faso was not expelling people, but arrogance. His words struck with deliberate force. Aid without respect is bondage. Partnership without dignity is fraud. The phrasing was sharp, but behind the slogans lay a sobering reality. Washington had already threatened to suspend cooperation, Paris muttered about collapse, and Brussels warned of isolation. Yet on the other side of the map, Moscow called him a lion, Ankara promised hospitals, and Beijing dispatched envoys with quiet offers. It was the strange logic of geopolitics. The same act that closed doors in the West opened others elsewhere. And this is where the human angle cuts through the noise. In markets, women worried about food prices. In clinics, doctors counted dwindling supplies. But in the city square, students shouted that they would rather live free and hungry than well-fed in chains. How often have Americans too chosen principle over comfort, walking out of jobs, refusing unfair contracts, because dignity weighed heavier than the paycheck? The behavior may look reckless on paper, but anyone who has tasted humiliation knows the calculation feels different in the moment. The deeper twist is that this expulsion was never just about Burkina Faso. Senators in Washington asked aloud, if one small nation could dismiss us, how many others might follow? And in Paris, newspapers painted Traoré as a gambler playing with fire in the Sahel. But on the walls of Ouagadougou, artists painted murals of flags changing hands, and crowds whispered that this was not a gamble. It was the beginning of a new story written by Africans themselves. As dawn broke, convoys of black SUVs carried embassy staff away, their tinted windows reflecting chants that trailed behind them. Sovereignty is not for sale. The sound was part triumph, part warning, echoing across a continent that has long lived in the shadow of other people's pens. And in that echo, the stage was set, not only for what Burkina Faso had just done, but for what comes next when a nation decides to walk alone. History usually shifts with treaties or wars. This time, it shifted with a locked gate and a lowered flag. Burkina Faso, one of the world's poorest nations, had just expelled the embassy of the world's richest. The imbalance itself felt unreal, like a David striking at Goliath with nothing but words and conviction. Yet conviction has consequences. Washington prepared sanctions, European leaders warned of collapse, and aid that once filled classrooms and stocked pharmacies now hung by a thread. Still, on the streets of Ouagadougou, the chants told a different story. Crowds believed that losing bread today was worth reclaiming dignity tomorrow. And maybe that paradox is what makes this moment resonate. Because every society, whether in Africa or America, has faced the same dilemma in its own way. Consider this. When dignity is taken away, people will walk out of jobs, break contracts, even risk homes to keep self-respect intact. Studies on workplace behavior show that once humiliation enters the room, the paycheck matters less. On a national scale, the same logic applies. Burkina Faso's gamble may look reckless on paper, but to its citizens, it feels like survival of the soul. The twist is that the world is now watching. Some see Traoré as a hero rewriting Africa's narrative. Others dismiss him as a reckless captain leading his country into hunger. But regardless of which side you choose, the fact remains, the American flag no longer flies in Ouagadougou, and that image alone has already traveled further than any official statement. So what do you think? From where you're watching, do you see this as courage or chaos? Would you trade comfort for dignity if the choice were yours? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear how your own experience shapes the answer. You've been watching Legends by the River. If this story moved something in you, don't scroll past. Hit subscribe, like, and share. Because after all, silence is how history gets written by others. Speaking up is how we claim it ourselves. And the story of Burkina Faso is far from over.